Imagine being asleep in your home when out of nowhere, FBI agents break down your front door, throw in flashbang grenades, drag your family out at gunpoint, and then they realize that they actually raided the wrong house. Now imagine the government's response isn't an apology to you. Instead, they argue that they had the discretion to do this and they cannot be held accountable. This is the exact scenario that already went all the way to the United States Supreme Court, where the family actually won a 9-0 unanimous ruling. But now there has been some major developments in this current case. A federal appeals court has just issued a brand new ruling involving government immunity, and the family is telling the 11th Circuit that is re-reviewing their case of this decision, and they argue that that new ruling further proves why the FBI should not escape accountability for raiding the wrong house. However, in response to all of this, the federal government's response is still that they cannot be held accountable. So let's break down what is currently happening in this critical battle and what is now played out after that 9-0 ruling by the Supreme Court. Now, before we jump into this video, if you want to support the channel, one of the best ways to do that is simply by subscribing. You can also hit the like button and also turn on all notifications to ensure you never miss these videos when I release them. Now, if you've been following this channel, you know that the Supreme Court recently issued a 9-0 unanimous ruling in favor of the Martin family, who were victims of an FBI wrong house raid. Back in 2017, FBI agents executed a pre-dawn raid in a suburban Atlanta area. Instead of going straight to the address that was on the warrant, one of the lead officers actually put the address into his personal GPS device, and he claims that the GPS routed him to a completely different address, and it took them to the home of Katrina Martin, where she lived at the time with her boyfriend and their 7-year-old son. It did not take them to the house where there was, the warrant that was actually targeted at it. Instead, it took them to the family's house when they were supposed to actually go to a home where there was believed to be some gang members engaging in criminal activities. When the FBI agents arrived at the home without warning, they smashed in the front door, detonated flashbang grenades inside the house. They pulled Katrina Martin and her boyfriend out of a closet where they were hiding with a shotgun. The FBI pointed guns at the family, pulled Katrina Martin out half naked, and also pulled out and detained their young son. Now, after the agents had detained the family, they did a search of the home. And while performing the search of the home, one of the agents noticed some mail on a coffee table, and he noticed that the address was different from the address on the warrant. That's when they realized that they had actually raided the wrong house, and they had this huge oh crap moment, we're at the wrong home. The officers then let the family go, told them that they would be back soon to explain, and the officers went about 3 homes down, which was actually separated by a cross street, so actually about another block away, and executed the raid against the correct home. Now, in response to this incident, the family sued the federal government. They brought a claim under the Federal Tort Claims Act, also known as the FTCA. Now, the government claimed immunity under the discretionary function exception of the FTCA and asserted that this case must actually be thrown out. Now, the lower court originally sided with the federal government and the FBI, but the Supreme Court eventually got involved. They stepped in and disagreed with that lower court ruling. The Supreme Court made something very clear in their 9-0 unanimous ruling. You don't automatically get immunity just because law enforcement exercised judgment. The government has to show that those decisions were grounded in actual policy considerations, not just mistakes. Because of this, the Supreme Court sent the case back down to the 11th Circuit to reapply and take a fresh look at this case using the new standard. Now, recently, the 11th Circuit reheard arguments in this case following that Supreme Court ruling, and one theme repeatedly emerged during those oral arguments. Where is the line between protected policy decisions and ordinary negligence? Throughout the hearing, the judges repeatedly pressed the federal government to explain how executing a warrant at the wrong house could possibly qualify as a protected policy judgment. The panel appeared concerned that under the government's theory, nearly any mistake made during a law enforcement operation could potentially be shielded from liability. Several judges on the 11th Circuit also pushed the government to explain how its position was consistent with the Supreme Court's recent 9-0 ruling. Now, after those arguments, the 11th Circuit also hinted at maybe wanting some additional briefing, but the 11th Circuit now has not requested that, so they have reviewed this case, and now they're set to rule on this issue. Now, recently, the Martin family filed a supplemental authority to the 11th Circuit, pointing to a brand new decision coming out of the 5th Circuit in a case called Morris versus the United States. And what's interesting is that the Morris case deals with almost the exact issue that appears to also be driving this Martin case. The question is whether government employees receive immunity when they negligently carry out an operation after making a discretionary decision. That distinction is incredibly important because nobody disputes that law enforcement officers make discretionary decisions. The question is, what happens when they execute those decisions improperly? According to the Martin family's filing, the Fifth Circuit recognized that there is a major difference between a policy decision and the execution of that decision. The court explained that even if government officials make a discretionary choice, they do not automatically receive immunity for every mistake that occurs afterwards. So in other words, choosing a course of action may involve discretion. Botching the execution of that choice is something entirely different. And that's exactly where this Martin case currently stands. Now, importantly, the federal government here is not simply conceding that Morris case out of the Fifth Circuit still helps the Martin family. In fact, the DOJ is arguing that the Morris case is completely different and it should be ignored by the 11th Circuit. According to the federal government, Morris involves negligent execution after a policy decision had already been made. The government argues that in this case, it's essentially different because in their eyes, the decision being challenged here is actually intertwined with law enforcement planning and operational judgment from the very beginning. So in other words, the DOJ is still trying to frame what happened as part of a protected discretionary law enforcement operation, and they say you can't piecemeal it, you can't parse it out. It has to be looked at the, totality of the entire incident. The government essentially says that courts cannot isolate individual mistakes from broader law enforcement decisions surrounding the actual raid. And if the court starts to second guess those decisions, the DOJ argues it risks turning nearly every law enforcement operation into potential civil liability. And that is one of the government's main concerns and one of their main positions in this case. Because if a plaintiff can simply point to a mistake that occurred during an operation and separate it from the broader decision-making process, they claim then that the discretionary function exception becomes significantly weaker. So the DOJ is urging the 11th Circuit not to read this Morris case too broadly and not use it in favor of the Martin family. They simply say that it should be disregarded, that it's persuasive evidence, but really it does not apply in this case. So in this case, the Martin family already has a unanimous ruling by the Supreme Court rejecting the government's broad immunity theory that they tried to use. The 11th Circuit judges appeared very skeptical of the current DOJ arguments that they presented during the oral arguments. And now the Martin family has identified a new piece of appellate authority coming out of the Fifth Circuit, which is reaching a similar conclusion, and they're trying to use that in support of their position currently in front of the 11th Circuit. However, the DOJ argues this case does not apply to this scenario here and should simply just be rejected. So this case continues to move in a very interesting direction. The Supreme Court unanimously ruled against the federal government once already. The 11th Circuit has now reheard this case, and the Martin family has placed a fresh federal appellate court decision before this court here, and they say that it supports their current position and that the 11th Circuit needs to rule in their favor. The question now is whether the 11th Circuit agrees that there is a meaningful difference and distinction between exercising discretion and negligently executing that type of decision. And ultimately, the question remains the very same in this case. Can the federal government claim immunity when agents raid the wrong house? So very soon from the 11th Circuit, we will get an answer. So that is the latest update in this Martin versus United States case that was sent back down to the lower court after that Supreme Court 9-0 decision. There's still a lot developing in this case, but as it moves forward, as we get more information, I will let you guys know. If you like this type of video and you would like to support the channel, one of the best ways to do that is simply to like, comment, and subscribe. But as always, thank you so much for all of your support. And never forget, this nation was built by armed scholars, and this nation will be maintained by armed scholars.